Mario Derksen, Novus Ordo Watch.
That's
of course,
right.
Everybody watching this podcast today is familiar with you. Mario, thank you for joining me. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. Mario, well before my eyes were open, you were pointing to the fundamental error with the resist the Pope movement, and namely that it creates a Protestant mindset where one is compelled to scrutinize everything that comes from the Pope. Every time he issues an authoritative teaching or a decision on a disciplinary matter or a liturgical matter, the faithful are being trained by this resist the Pope movement to take it upon themselves to scrutinize and to maybe disagree and to apply something that they found more favorable from a different papacy and so on and so forth. And today we're going to talk about an excellent example of how this poison can spread to flat out Protestantism. And it comes to us not from the chair of Peter, the one that is empty today, but rather from the desk of Peter, and that is Peter Kwasniewski, who, before we get into talking about him and the example that he gives us of how Protestantism reigns in the resist the Pope movement, I want to say that I've interacted with him a few times, and he's always gentlemanly and approachable. So this is not a personal matter.
No.
It's just that he is the de facto leader, in a sense, of the resist the Pope movement today.
Yes.
And some of his work really is illustrative of the problems in that movement.
Yes, he seems to kind of provide the academic underpinning of the various, traditionalist ideas that I call them semi-traditional, the recognize and resist traditionalists have been upholding or maintaining. And so he's very popular. His work is plentiful. He writes a lot. He publishes a lot. Unfortunately, so much of it runs afoul of, what you find when you simply look at the old theology books or go through the old magisterial texts. So much so that at some point, Peter Kwasniewski, I guess, himself realized the discrepancy between what he's saying and what is on, what is on the book, so to speak, before Vatican II, that he started saying we need to rethink the papacy. Now, rethinking, that's kind of a watchword for modernists, like a dog whistle, right? In the Catholic Church, you don't rethink dogma. You don't rethink doctrine. But, it's unfortunate that I guess what's really, led him to this point is simply the fact that he's accepting the false Vatican II popes as real popes. And that has forced him into this sort of, into this corner now, where instead of rethinking Jorge Bergoglio, Francis, right, and his 5 predecessors, instead of rethinking them, their status, he's rethinking the papacy instead. And, this even just on a surface level, this doesn't make any sense. Who is or isn't Pope is a historical contingency. But the dogma and the doctrine regarding the papacy, these things are not like contingencies in the same way. Like it is perennially true, right? And so it doesn't make any sense to seek to uphold a particular claimant to the papacy or even a particular series of claimants at the expense of the doctrine on the papacy. Then you definitely have not upheld the Pope or the papacy, because if the papacy no longer means what it used to mean, how much sense then does it make to say Francis is Pope?
Well, and there is a logic to the approach insofar as if the Pope is what the Church has always taught, you cannot reconcile that with these men who are claiming to be the Pope since the Council. So it's a baby with the bathwater scenario.
Totally.
Right?
Yes. I can totally appreciate the seeing the importance of no state of conscience likes the MTC, right? The Holy See being vacant. Nobody likes not knowing exactly what is going on, where the next pope is going to come from, and so forth. So I can totally appreciate the intent to not want to go there, but at what cost? At some point why can't we simply say, regarding certain issues that we don't know, we don't have a clear answer, or it's disputed, it's mysterious. That is, of course, not very satisfying, but it's a lot better than, having to basically rethink Catholicism. Because if you rethink the papacy, you're rethinking Catholicism. Catholicism is the faith is an organic singular whole. It's not elements, right? So if you change one dogma, you've changed everything. It's not something where you can just say, well, we'll leave the rest intact, but the papacy we're going to change. Well, because it's all resting on the same authority. If the papacy is false, then the authority that gave you the papacy is not reliable. And if that authority is not reliable, then neither is any other dogma, whether it be the resurrection or transubstantiation or social kingship of Christ or anything. So I thought the other day, on March 26th, Peter Kwasniewski published an article on the New Liturgical Movement website. It's newliturgicalmovement.org. And the article is entitled, "Do Priests or Religious Need Special Permission to Pray a Pre-55 Breviary?"
Right. I've opened this up on the screen, and here is
great.
the
Thank you.
article
March
to which you're
26th,
referring.
2025. And in this article, the author really kind of shows just, let me say it a little polemically, like how insane this whole recognize and resist stuff is getting. Maybe we should explain first what the breviary is, and then what is a pre-55 breviary. Maybe you can just comment on that real quick. Or
the divine office.
Right.
It's required of priests and religious to pray the office every day. Pius X revised the breviary. And what was that year, Mario?
1911.
1911.
Yes. Well, the breviary was like revised, again and again, something here, something there. As time went on, I can't remember now where I read about, when the first, breviary legislation was issued or whatever, but it's essentially the public prayer of the church that's outside of the sacraments, outside of Mass, that this is just obviously the Catholic Church prays, gives glory and worship and honor to God in a lot more than just the Holy Mass, right? It's just that the laity have to attend the Holy Mass once a week on Sundays and on holy days of obligation. But outside of that, there's still a lot of public official prayer going on. And that is that prayer is contained in what's typically known as the breviary or divine office or the canonical hours. In the Novus Ordo, they call it the Liturgy of the Hours. Right. And it's at set times or at least in a certain sequence. It's essentially, like a morning prayer, midday prayer, noon prayer, early afternoon prayer, late after, that kind of, it's that kind of setup. And so in 1955, Pope Pius XII made some more changes to the breviary. And so Peter Kwasniewski is being asked if priests or religious need special permission to pray the breviary from before the reforms of Pope Pius XII in 1955. Now, the reason laity are not mentioned, but it's only priests and religious, is because they are the ones that have the, as you just mentioned, Louie, the canonical obligation, right? They make a promise or a vow, I'm not sure, at ordination at a particular, or at profession, to pray the breviary, the entire breviary every day. There are some exceptions permitted, but the laity don't have that obligation. So that's why the laity are not mentioned. And it's just a question, well, essentially what's being asked is, if a priest or religious has the obligation to pray the breviary, can he use the pre-1955 breviary, or must he use, the Novus Ordo breviary or the 1962 breviary?
Right.
And now, normally, this is a question that if it's not answered in a particular theology book, you would simply ask the Vatican. You would send an inquiry to the, under Bergoglio now, it's the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, I believe, and you would ask them, okay? Now, why doesn't Peter Kwasniewski say, let's submit a petition to the Vatican and ask them if a special permission is needed, or if the obligation can be fulfilled using the Pre-55 Breviary? You want to guess as to why Peter Kwasniewski isn't doing that?
Well, for one, he doesn't trust their judgment. And for two, he knows what the answer will be.
And it's an answer he doesn't want to hear. That's
Exactly.
right. So this is already like the first red flag. Okay. Why is a Peter Kwasniewski, who is a PhD in philosophy, has no degree in theology, why is he answering a question that actually the Holy See should answer? Now, we don't believe that the authorities in Rome are the lawful Catholic authorities. So it makes sense that we wouldn't ask that question. We wouldn't, ask them that question, because we're saying they're fake. They're charlatans. But Peter Kwasniewski thinks they're the real lawful prelates. And you'd better believe, if the Dicastery for Divine Worship came out and said, use whichever breviary you like, you can bet your bottom dollar Peter Kwasniewski would be touting their authority as the Dicastery. The Vatican has just confirmed, has just made clear that everyone is allowed to do that. And of course, that goes, right? It's when he expects them to say something different that he's not interested in their judgment.
Well, this just goes to illustrate that, while people in that movement, they call Francis Pope, they call that entity currently in possession of the Vatican, the Church.
Mm-hmm.
In their behavior, it's evident that they really don't believe that. They don't treat the Pope this man as if he's the Pope. They do not treat that entity.
That's right.
Currently in occupation of the Vatican as the Church.
Yes.
Mario, I think one of the things that Peter put very early in this article that we're about to discuss that's very telling, in a sense, he immediately takes the question at hand from this person, can I pray the Pre-55 Breviary? And he says the same could be asked about taking up the Pre-Pius X Breviary, which very early on illustrates that this thing, once this train leaves the station, there really is nothing to stop it at all. Everything's up for debate.
Yes. Logic is very unmerciful, Logic, it'll drive you. If you start with the wrong idea, you will be forced to conclude the most erroneous things at times, but normally anyone else would say, okay, well, gee, I've been led to absurdity here. Obviously, I must have gone wrong somewhere. But unfortunately, people like Peter Kwasniewski aren't doing that. So they're finding out that, well, wait a minute, if I want to pray the Pre-55 Breviary because it's whatever more traditional, and then I find out that actually the Pre-55 Breviary was the 1911 Breviary, which was considerably different from the one before 1911. Well, why can't we, if we can reject the 55 Breviary, why not the 1911 one?
And why not the one before that?
Exactly. And, where does it end? And I think we should probably make clear at this point also that we're not saying that the Pope cannot change the breviary or that the Pope cannot ever change the Mass. Rather, it is how the Mass was changed and how the breviary was changed by Paul VI that shows he did not have the papacy. He was not the Pope. He did not have the authority from Christ that the papacy confers. And so we don't have to get into this more now, but I just want to make that clear, because sometimes people think that, well, wait a minute, so are you saying that the Pope can change these things? Of course he can. But he cannot, let's take the Mass, for example. Yes, the Pope can change the Mass. For example, Monsignor Joseph Clifford Fenton, certainly no modernist, he wrote at the eve of Vatican II that the Council could change much of the rite of the Mass. But of course, what the Catholic Church and the Pope cannot do is make the Catholic Mass into a Protestant meal service, and that's what Paul VI did. And so the problem is not that the Mass was changed, but how it was changed. So maybe we'll just start by, if you could just maybe kind of scroll through that article a little bit, and I'll read some things and make some comments. So at first, Dr. Kwasniewski starts out with giving his initial view of the matter, and then he will give, I think it is a total of 4 different expert opinions from various clergy and canon lawyers he consulted. So, one of the big problems that kind of throws a monkey wrench into this whole thing for Kwasniewski is that, of course, since he accepts Francis as Pope and the whole Novus Ordo Church as the Catholic Church, there is a bit of how should I say, it makes it difficult to. You can't at one and the same time try to apply Catholic principles, but then you're dealing with people who believe that adultery can be willed by God and blessings can be given to homo couples and so forth. So it makes the whole thing a bit inconsistent, and we see that in the first paragraph there under my initial view, where he says. This is Kwasniewski speaking. In the past, my standard line has been, there is no official statement that you can do this. In other words, that you can use the Pre-55 Breviary. If one can do it, it is because what earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too, and it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. And here he's quoting Benedict XVI, right? Joseph Ratzinger. So first, Kwasniewski is right in saying that there is no official statement that you can do this, but that actually should have been the end right there. There's no statement that you can do this. If anything, you'll need to consult the Vatican and ask them, right? That would have been the answer. But because Kwasniewski doesn't want that answer, he now enlists Joseph Ratzinger to help him. And because Ratzinger wrote, I think it was in the accompanying letter, when he released the Motu Proprio Summorum Pontificum in 2007, he also released a letter to the bishops of the world in which he explained why he was releasing Summorum Pontificum. Okay, explained this at some length. And I believe that is where the quote is from.
So one of the things I want to mention is that quote that Kwasniewski gives from the accompanying letter of Benedict. The part that I'm sure appealed to him the most is the second sentence.
Oh.
It behooves all of us to preserve the riches which have developed in the church's faith and prayer and to give them their proper place. Now, Benedict speaking here to the bishops, that's number one. But number two, it doesn't behoove all of us. It behooves the Pope. That's his job.
Right.
To preserve
the
riches that have developed in the church. Even the bishops, apart from the Pope, don't have that ability.
Well, I guess they probably have some kind of, certainly not against the Pope. Right.
Right. Not to the extent that Peter is attempting to take it, saying that the Pope has ruled authoritatively on a liturgical matter, but it's up to us to preserve the riches that existed before he stepped into the arena to muck things up.
Yeah. Well, Ratzinger had to write something, right? He had to find a way to justify bringing the traditional Latin Mass back, or at least the 1962 Missal, while at the same time keeping the Novus Ordo alive. So he had to come up with something, and, that's how he did it. So all of a sudden it's, oh, well, it was sacred then and it is therefore sacred now. Well, that's not what Paul VI said. But, you know, Benedict XVI was kind of pretending that, oh, well, you know, it had really never really been forbidden, right? Because it couldn't be. Well, yeah, it was forbidden. It was forbidden by Paul VI. Absolutely it was. And that's why you needed an indult to be allowed to say it, right? Right? Because the law forbade it. So the indult is what makes, it's a concession for you to be exempt from that law in that particular case. So that's why it's called the indult mass, right? Because it started out as an indult. Certain priests were allowed to still offer the 1962 mass according to the 1962 missal. And so it became known as the indult mass until 2007, when then Benedict XVI, I guess as a matter of law, made it legal for any priest to offer the traditional mass, at least privately, right? Can't remember all the details now, but let me see. Let's not get off too much off track there. But that is a good point. So yeah. So Peter Kwasniewski is enlisting Joseph Ratzinger, and he does this in other. This is not the only time he's doing it. I've seen him do it in other blog posts or articles. When it comes in handy, then Ratzinger is useful to quote for him, and then he'll. In fact, he does it again later concerning whether the Pope is an absolute monarch or not, because Ratzinger said something about that. And so, but this is just no way of doing theology, right? I mean, you can't say, well, Ratzinger, modernist, bad. Oh, but over here he said something that really works for me right now. So now I'm going to use Ratzinger as an authority. I mean,
of course, if Francis should accidentally say something useful with regard to liturgy or doctrine, of course, he's quotable as well.
Right.
Why not?
Right. And then on the flip side, if St. Pius X said something that doesn't work with Peter Kwasniewski's theory, well, now he's going against St. Pius X, and then, of course, people like to point out, okay, well, but St. Pius X wasn't infallible in everything he said. Well, that's true, but neither is Peter Kwasniewski, So it's unlike Kwasniewski, though, Pius X was the Pope and authoritative, therefore, in his decisions. Now, so
Mario, if I may, this might be a good time just to remind viewers of, what it means to follow the Pope, whether he's teaching with the fullness of his authority or not. This is from the First Vatican Council. Mm-hmm. Wherefore we teach and declare that divine obedience to the Roman Pontiff, because he possesses the preeminence of ordinary power over every other church, and that this jurisdictional power of the Roman Pontiff is both episcopal and immediate. Both clergy and faithful, of whatever rank and dignity, both singly and collectively, are bound to submit to this power by the duty of hierarchical subordination and true obedience, and this not only in matters concerning faith and morals, but also in those which regard the discipline and government of the church throughout the world. And of course, included in that would be liturgical matters.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I'm going to pull up another quote here if I can find it. It's funny. I thought I had all my ducks in a row here, but then sometimes it just gets so overwhelming with all the different resources you have. Pope Pius IX, and honestly, I'm like, this is not surprising and it is not weird. It makes perfect sense, right? In his apostolic letter, non sine gravissimo, and I'll get you the date on that. That was February 24th, 1870. Pope Pius IX said, all those who glory in the title of Catholic must not only be united to him, meaning to the Pope, in matters of faith and dogmatic truth, but also be submissive to him in matters of liturgy and discipline. Okay, unquote. That's Pope Pius IX, non sine gravissimo, apostolic letter. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, who is going to determine, in the Catholic Church, who is going to determine how the Holy Mass will be celebrated, if not the Pope? right? What Kwasniewski is trying to do here in his article is kind of establish this idea that there's really, like, above the Pope, there's this tradition to which the Pope must also subject himself. And if he doesn't do that, why, then we can just take this tradition and essentially cancel out whatever the Pope just did. What I'd like to know is, if that were true, how come we don't see it anywhere? Right? Why don't we find that in any catechism, in any theology book? Right? It should be in there, right? If it's that important, and if it's that clear. Instead, what we usually get from people like Peter Kwasniewski is kind of like they're well, we might get some proof texts about obedience and how you can't obey if a command is sinful and so on, but that's really not to the point here, right? But this idea that there is this tradition that is above the Pope, it comes up again when he goes against St. Pius X, right? Because, of course, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if it's good enough to cancel out Paul VI, why not St. Pius X?
Well, part of the problem is, of course, Mario, the true popes, they were bound to tradition, and that was clear in their behavior and in all of their teaching, because they were the recipients of the gift of truth and never failing faith, according to the First Vatican Council. Never failing faith.
Yes.
Such that they could protect the faithful from the poisonous fruit of error.
Yes.
Which would be that which goes against tradition, capital T.
Yeah. So, and here, I guess one of the problems is we rarely ever see a definition of tradition, right? These days, everyone loves to talk about defending tradition, and we need to restore tradition in the church and all that. But what do you actually mean by that? Now, sacred tradition exists as the deposit of faith, right? Is passed through sacred tradition and through sacred scripture. That's a divine revelation, right? Is contained in those two sources. But that's usually not what is meant by it, because certainly, even though, of course, the dogma of the Holy Mass and so forth, that is all part of the deposit of faith. Certainly quo primum, for example, like the rubrics of quo primum, they're not, contained. Those weren't handed to the apostles by our blessed Lord and Savior, right? That's not to say that these aren't very important and very venerable, liturgical traditions, but just that it's not the same thing as sacred tradition, as the rule of faith. And so it's closely connected to it, no question about it. And we're not saying that the Pope can do whatever he pleases. We do agree that there are limits to papal authority. There are limits to the papacy, but those limits, the way I put it is, they're applied, like those limits are imposed by God a priori, meaning God prevents the Pope from decreeing, legislating, teaching anything that would go against that. Right? That's how the papal authority is limited in that sense. The Pope, when we say that the Pope, for example, cannot, say, make adultery permissible, right? That's true. But what that means is that the Pope will never at any point issue a decree or an encyclical or a bull or anything that says adultery is now permissible, right? Only in that sense does it make sense to speak of limits of papal authority. What Peter Kwasniewski and other recognize and resist theologians will argue is that the way the papacy is limited is that the Pope can, in theory, issue such a decree permitting adultery, and then the faithful and all those under the Pope need to rise up and essentially get him to recant and cancel out that decree, and that because he's not allowed to do that, right? That in that sense, that's what they understood by the limits of papal authority, so that the Pope could actually decree whatever he likes, but then if it's against divine law, then it doesn't count. Okay? That makes absolutely no sense, and that's also not what you get when you read the Old like when you read the papal magisterium about the papacy, right? The church councils and all the encyclicals and the decrees and so forth. The only way they make sense is if you understand them in the way I just described, that the Pope, whatever the Pope cannot go against, he will not actually go against. Because otherwise you'd need another authority that is above the Pope to tell you when the Pope was wrong and when he needs to be corrected and when he needs to be resisted.
And unfortunately for Peter's many followers, he's become that person.
Yeah, a
right?
little bit, right? Yeah.
Yeah, in a sense. And one of the things that strikes me in reading things that he's written, he's scholarly. You know, he has a certain formation.
Absolutely.
Catholicism is not a faith of experts, right? Our Lord commanded us to be as little children. In order to be as little children, we need to have Holy Mother Church. We need a Holy Father to serve as our father, teacher, and guide.
Yes.
You know, we're not required to be theologians, philosophers, hold PhDs, and so forth just to be faithful Catholics.
Essentially, Kwasniewski is doing his own theology, and he's doing so without a mission from what he considers to be the lawful ecclesiastical hierarchy. Okay, they did not commission him to do that, and in fact, he's going against that. Right, so he's entirely on his own in terms, like, it's all being done on his own authority or lack thereof. And that is, you know, what is also essentially, like, you know, this where Protestantism comes in. In the end, he is the standard. He decides. And we can show just how true that is in that little video that we have prepared. That is, you can find on the Novus Ordo Watch YouTube channel. It's just a 2-minute video in which you see Peter Kwasniewski telling the people gathered to hear him lecture on Traditionis Custodes, in which he tells them that the decree Francis issued forbidding the traditional Latin Mass is really null and void.
Let's take a look at it, Mario.
Yep.
This is why Traditionis Custodes is absolutely null and utterly void from its first letter to its last punctuation mark.
Amen.
And that is why it is not only not necessary to follow Traditionis Custodes or any further legislation or policy based on it, it is rather necessary not to follow it.
That music gets me every time I watch that.
Yeah, I had fun making that, of course. But I mean, you see, this is just insane, right? The man who is supposedly the Pope, they all believe he's the Pope, right? The people listening to Kwasniewski. And Kwasniewski essentially just decides that, no, that decree is null and void. Okay? On what authorities say that? Well, he has this idea that there's this tradition that is above the Pope, and that because that tradition supposedly says something else, he can just go ahead and tell people that decree is not, that is something to cry about, that decree that decree is just null and void, and he's willing there to, and I mean, and the applause, right? Did you notice the applause? I mean, they were cheering and they love that stuff. And so,
Absolutely null and utterly
oh
void.
yes. You know, if Francis is the Pope, then I have news for Dr. Kwasniewski. No, it ain't null and void, you know. Um, and the quote from St. Pius X, maybe I should read that was on the screen for those people who maybe are listening to this podcast while they're driving and stuff. And of course, we'll have the links, I'm sure, in the show notes for this episode, where you can find all these things. But this is just beautiful, and this is what I mean when I say that when you actually read the papal teaching on these matters, you always get something other than recognize and resist. Okay, and you know that's true because if it backed up recognize and resist, they'd be quoting these things left and right, right? So that alone already shows you that they have no case. Their case is a novelty. Now, St. Pius X, what I'm about to quote, this was an audience of May 10th, 1909. So about 2 years since the condemnation of modernism. And of course, to be fair, you know, obviously St. Pius X wasn't speaking about exactly the same kind of situation that we have today, and people like Peter Kwasniewski. Obviously, he had other people and other, you know, the modernist movement in mind, right, or the liberalizing movement. But it's still, what he says is still relevant because he's expressing the principles that refute this, and those principles are the same that refute Kwasniewski today. So let me just quote from this address that's called, the address is named Con Vera Soddisfazione, and it's got that name because those are the first 3 words in the decree, or rather in the address. And so I'm going to take 2 sections or two paragraphs from this and quote that. And this is also what you just saw in the video. Quote, so this is St. Pius X speaking. With a system of sophisms and errors, they falsify the concept of obedience inculcated by the Church. They arrogate to themselves the right of judging the actions of authority, even to the extent of ridiculing them. They attribute to themselves a mission to impose a reform, a mission which they have received neither from God nor from any authority. Sound familiar? They limit obedience to purely exterior actions, even if they do not resist authority or rebel against it, opposing the faulty judgment of some individual without any real competence, or of their own inner conscience, deceived by vain subtleties, to the judgment and commandment of the one who by divine mandate is their lawful judge, master, and shepherd. Okay, that's pretty powerful, right? And then another elsewhere in the text, do not let yourselves be deceived by the subtle declarations of others who do not cease to pretend that they wish to be with the Church, to love the Church, to fight for her, so that she will not lose the masses, to work for the Church so that she will come to understand the times, and so to win back the people and attach them to herself. Judge these men according to their works. If they maltreat and despise the ministers of the Church and even the Pope, if they try by every means to minimize their authority, to evade their direction, and to disregard their counsels, if they do not fear to raise the standard of rebellion, what Church are these men speaking about? Unquote. So that's St. Pius X. But as you know, we'll come to see, Peter Kwasniewski also has some words of criticism for St. Pius X, precisely because he considers himself, I guess, to be on this mission of correcting everything that does not jibe with his own understanding of the preeminence of tradition.
Absolutely. Once you raise the banner of rebellion against a pope, every one of them is a potential enemy in a given circumstance.
Mhm.
And the thing that comes out here to me, Mario, is the extent to which otherwise intelligent people who are sincere and genuinely want to be Catholic,
Mhm.
the lengths that they will not go in order to avoid even entertaining the idea that these men who have occupied the highest place in the Vatican since Vatican II aren't true popes. And that entity in Rome is not Holy Mother Church.
Yeah.
It's something else. It's like they won't even give that a passing thought, and they'll go to great lengths to avoid even giving it consideration, which is stunning to me. But
yes, that's the problem. And, this goes to show once again that, like, how important sedevacantism is, or how important it is to recognize that these men, these six since the death of Pope Pius XII, have not been real popes. It's not just some, opinion or some sort of, illicit judgment. Like, how dare these sedevacantists say that, right? Why don't we just keep tradition and then let God decide who is or isn't pope? The people who make these objections have totally not understood how it all works. Like, this all hangs together. You can't say Francis is the pope and then act as if what the church teaches about the papacy doesn't apply to him. Doesn't work that way.
well, and one of the things that the church teaches about the papacy is that the pope is the proximate source of unity in the church. And in this case, we're talking about the unity of worship and
Yes.
and also unity of governance.
Yes,
Right?
and the guarantee of the deposit of faith.
Right, all
Which
three.
means a situation will never arise in which the papal judgment is contrary to the deposit of faith, to the known deposit of faith, such that everyone else could, would know, oh, this is actually, here the Pope is teaching heresy, and so he's not in line with the ultimate source of the faith, right? The remote rule of faith. So therefore now we have to go by the remote rule and kind of ignore him. That will never happen. That is one of the beautiful things about the papacy. Got to remember, it's a divine institution. It's not a human institution. The way the semi-trads view the papacy, it might as well be something instituted by Martin Luther. Follow the Pope when he's right. Well, whoop-de-doo.
Absolutely.
What does that say about that means that the Pope has no authority of his own, because that's what that's what the Protestants will say about their local pastors. Well, you follow the pastor when he's right. So when he teaches the Bible, and when he doesn't teach the Bible, you have to reject that and go by the Bible. Okay, well then why do we have a pastor? What's the point of that?
And it's almost a step worse for these guys, because rather than treating the Pope as if he is the proximate source of unity of faith, worship, governance, they treat him as if he is the primary source and the greatest danger to the faith and to worship. In other words, he is the enemy of unity.
Yes, and why?
He embodies an assault against.
And why are they saying that? Because since Vatican II, that's how it's
what they've been. Right, exactly, which means they're not the Pope.
Because look,
obviously,
if this were 1957, Peter Kwasniewski, I don't think, would be saying these things.
Yeah, certainly not.
Right? What's driving all of these errors is the fact that they're trying so hard to have the Vatican II Church be the Catholic Church and these false Novus Ordo popes be real valid popes. And in order to make that work, even just a little bit, they just have to destroy Catholicism in the process. So they don't seem to realize it. Like, don't you understand? You have solved nothing in the end. What have you gained if you have a pope but Catholicism is false? Well, then the Pope is false too, the papacy. So it's an insane situation. But you know what? Let's finally get on here with what Kwasniewski has written. There's always so much to say. Yeah, so, as we said originally, whether or not a priest or religious needs special permission to be able to fulfill his canonical obligation for the breviary, using the pre-1955 breviary, well, that's really a question for the Vatican. And therefore, that's where that question should be directed for those people who believe that the modernists in the Vatican are the lawful Catholic authority. Now, Kwasniewski, to his credit at least, didn't just go with his own opinion, but actually asked 4 different individuals whom he considers experts in the matter for their opinion. Okay? And unfortunately, the experts are not mentioned by name. They're only identified as by their function. So expert opinion number 1 is a secular priest from an Ecclesia Dei institute. Expert opinion number 2 is a Benedictine monk. Let's see, expert opinion number 3 is a diocesan priest and canon lawyer. And expert number 4 is another Benedictine. And that's unfortunate. That my guess is not that these individuals did not want to be known, but I'm suspecting that Kwasniewski just didn't want to disclose their names just to protect them, so lest they be maybe tainted by association with recognizing. I don't know, but that's just what I'm thinking. But if we briefly look through what we see there, actually, before we do that, let me point out what is missing from Kwasniewski's analysis, and I believe also from the expert opinions, and that is the Code of Canon Law is never brought up, which is unfortunate because the 1917 Code of Canon Law talks about the obligation of praying the breviary in Canon 135. And here I'm using the well-known Edward Peters translation of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, published by Ignatius Press. Canon 135. Quote, clerics constituted in major orders, except those mentioned in Canons 213 and 214, are bound by the obligation of reciting completely the canonical hours according to the proper and approved liturgical books. Unquote. That is where the obligation comes from. So the Church in her law says that clerics in major orders, with some exceptions, are bound of reciting the breviary, and this is the most important part, according to the proper and approved liturgical books. And of course, it's not talking about what was approved in 1146 or 1728. It's talking about what is approved now. And if we look at what St. Pius X, for example, said regarding the Roman Breviary, which version is approved, to his credit, Kwasniewski quotes the most important portion of that decree. It's the decree Divino Afflatu, and it was published in 1911. Let me see if I can find the actual date. November 1st, 1911. And if you scroll down a little bit on the Kwasniewski article, you will find the quote where St. Pius X leaves absolutely no doubt about whether, or rather, what is the approved liturgical book according to which the Roman Breviary is to be prayed. Let me see. Let me see where we have it. 1 second. Okay, it is under my response to the. So this is under expert opinion number 2. There it is. Perfect. Therefore, by the authority of these letters. I'm not going to quote the whole thing, but let's just quote like the most important portion here, right? St. Pius X revised the breviary, right? And with these revisions, he then decreed, quote, we proclaim the penalties prescribed in law against all who fail in their office of reciting the canonical hours every day. All such are to know that they will not be satisfying this grave duty unless they use this our disposition of the psaltery. Okay? In other words, in fact, actually, let me back up and quote the first sentence. Therefore, by the authority of these letters, we first of all abolish the order of the psaltery as it is at present in the Roman Breviary, and we absolutely forbid the use of it after the first day of January of the year 1913. Okay? So Pius X said, here's the new breviary. No later than January 1st, 1913, you must use this new breviary, and you cannot satisfy your obligation in law with using any other breviary. Okay, so no, you can't go back and say, oh, but what was sacred in 1909 is still sacred now. Well, you can pray that breviary, but it's not going to fulfill your obligation, meaning you'd have to still pray the new breviary to fulfill your obligation. This is not difficult, right? This is not complicated. It
Mario,
seems
the
to me that
question being floated it was just answered. And as you said, I mean, in one sense, it's to Peter's credit that he provided that quote from
yes,
Pius X. On the other hand, it's an example of the cognitive dissonance. I mean, he opened up this article by saying the same question could be asked about taking up the pre-Pius X breviary. Well, no, that question cannot be asked, not if you're faithful and you're, acceding to the authority of the Pope. He was very clear here. Like you said, it's not complicated.
exactly. And I don't have the decree of Pius XII in front of me now, but there it's pretty clear. I'm pretty sure it's the same idea that this is now the approved liturgical book, and you have an obligation to pray according to this book. That doesn't mean, of course, that what came before was somehow wrong. Of course not. But it means it no longer fulfills the obligation. So what I think Dr. Kwasniewski does not understand sufficiently, and what he should meditate on, is Matthew 16:19. Let me quote it. Okay? Where our blessed Lord says to St. Peter, "And I will give to thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt bind upon earth, it shall be bound also in heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt loose upon earth, it shall be loosed also in heaven." Right? Rome has spoken. The case is closed. This is the power of the keys. The Pope says this is now what we use for the breviary. That's it. It doesn't matter what Peter Kwasniewski thinks about it. Right? Putting it bluntly, that it's just, this ends the debate. And of course, the Pope then does, end his decree with, and we might want to, I don't want to get into the whole topic of quo primum now, but this will sound familiar to some people. "This we publish, declare, sanction, decreeing that these our letters always are and shall be valid and effective, notwithstanding apostolic constitutions and ordinances, general and special, and everything else whatsoever to the contrary. Wherefore let nobody infringe or temerariously oppose this page of our abolition, revocation, permission, ordinance, precept, statute, indult, mandate, and will. But if anybody shall presume to attempt this, let him know that he will incur the indignation of Almighty God and of his apostles, saints Peter and Paul." Well, guess what? Peter Kwasniewski does not think this applies to him, right? Because he's quoting this here not because he agrees with it, but to show that St. Pius X really overstepped his authority. Because he says, and this is right underneath, so this is Kwasniewski speaking now, "So it seems to me there must be a theological rationale for maintaining that something like this decree is null and void from the get-go. Not that Pius X's breviary is thereby invalidated or rendered illegal, but his attempt to prohibit all contrary customs, no matter how venerable, seems like it would have to be null and void. If we take serious the concept of tradition and do not think it is totally subject to the will of the reigning pontiff, confer Benedict XVI's comments about the limits of the Pope's authority." There he goes again, right? Here he's bringing up Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, to correct St. Pius X. This is insane. But of course, if he can go against Paul VI, why not Pius X, right? No, but see, the problem is here, right? He writes, "If we take seriously the concept of tradition and do not think it is totally subject to the will of the reigning pontiff." Well, that's his error. There is no such thing as tradition above the Pope in the sense that he means, like, that the Pope can say something contrary to it and then we ignore the Pope and go with tradition instead. That's bogus. That's nonsense, which is why he can't find it anywhere in the theology books or in the magisterial teaching, right? He has to go to Joseph Ratzinger to make his point because it doesn't exist in the pre-Vatican II church. So this is serious business, right? So he just said that, and notice also, this underscores also the craziness of it. After quoting these very clear words of St. Pius X, who, by the way, was not only Pope, I mean, that is, of course, what gives him his authority, but he even got an extra layer of approval from God by being a canonized saint. So not only is he using the power of the keys, he's also a canonized saint, which doesn't mean every single act is perfect, but it does mean that God was pleased with his exercise of the papacy. Is supremely pleased, actually. So after these rather clear words of St. Pius X, very authoritative, look at what Kwasniewski, look at his language. It seems to me there must be, and he talks about his attempt to prohibit, seems like it would have to be null and void if we take serious this concept of tradition. That's very, what do we call this language? Let's say very careful language. Well, it seems to me it could, if, it suggests that maybe, no, excuse me, you just heard the words of the Sovereign Pontiff. It doesn't matter what seems to you. Sorry. Right?
Right. But now he does say there must be a theological rationale.
We couldn't possibly be wrong about this.
My recollection of having read this article is that he never really provided that theological rationale.
Right. Oh, no, I think he would probably point to one of his many books or two of his many books, like, but again, this too is, it runs afoul of what St. Pius X said, right? About you have to follow the Pope and not some other person instead, right? Who makes a better case. That's not how the Catholic Church works.
Mario, one of the arguments that these men will bring up very frequently, I want to show this to you.
Okay.
I've seen this in a number of different venues. Hopefully I can find it. But here we go. This is a quote from one of Kwasniewski's works, and it's being cited here by Timothy Flanders on 1 Peter 5. Pius X reordered part of the Roman Rites prayer. Pius XII refashioned the heart of the Roman Rites year. Paul VI replaced the entire Roman Rite with a modern rite. They behave as if, and the theory is that one act necessarily invited the next, when really one of these three things is not like the others, right?
Yes.
I mean, what Paul VI did was created a rite that's Protestantized and is not Catholic and leads people away from the true faith.
Yeah.
The same cannot be said of the management of the liturgy by Pius X and Pius XII.
Right.
But this is forms the very heart of their argument. For many of those religious orders, too, that choose to use the pre-58 rubrics, for example, there's a couple of them. The Bishop Sanborn's Institute of, they use
Roman
pre-1958.
Yes.
Right. Same with the Society of St. Pius V. With the rationale being these things were they greased the skids for Paul VI to come in and wreck the faith as he did. But I don't find any validity to that argument. Do you?
No. I would say, though, that if I'm not mistaken, they're usually the way they make their case is by saying that I think they would agree. I'm sure they would agree that if it were 1957 or back in 1957, those changes were mandatory. Okay. Are you still there?
Okay. Oh, yeah. I'm with you.
That these changes were mandatory when they were made. They're saying, like, now, in retrospect, with everything that has happened, we don't think Pope Pius XII would want us to use these changes. Okay? Now, I don't know. I would say that's conjecture. It's safer to go by what Pius XII actually did decree. But so you've got a little bit of disagreement about that, and similar things among sedevacantists, and that's unfortunate. But at the very least, everybody has to agree that these changes were mandatory when they were made, and no, in 1957 you could not simply decide to use a different Holy Week.
Right, Mario, you provided an outstanding quote. I wish I had it here. Maybe I'll be able to pull it up and share it on the screen when I finish posting. But there was a apostolic letter, I believe it was, by Leo XIII called Epistola Tua, where he very specifically states that it does not show the right submission to the Holy Roman Pontiff to prefer the rulings of a previous pope to the rulings of a present pope.
Yes.
Or
Do
to
you want me to
appeal
pull
to
it up?
the, sure, it's a fantastic quote because it's so entirely applicable here.
Yes. Let me see. There we go. Okay, Pope Leo XIII. This is letter to Cardinal, let me see, to the Archbishop of Paris. And I don't have his name here right now. This was June 17th, 1885. Pope Leo XIII, quote, "Similarly, it is to give proof of a submission which is far from sincere to set up some kind of opposition between one pontiff and another. Those who, faced with two differing directives, reject the present one to hold to the past, are not giving proof of obedience to the authority which has the right and duty to guide them, and in some ways they resemble those who, on receiving a condemnation, would wish to appeal to a future council or to a pope who is better informed." Unquote. Yeah, that's actually the you see this a lot in this among the Lefebvrists and other, recognize and resist traditionalists. They'll appeal to, in the future there's going to be a pope who will side with us, right? And then there will be a council to condemn Vatican II and all that. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't think I am, the Code of Canon Law actually has an excommunication for that, for making that argument. Appealing, I think it's called, appealing the judgment of the Roman Pontiff to an ecumenical council, because that's like the heresy of conciliarism. That's at least suggestive of that heresy. And but anyway, I don't want to make that point now. I didn't do enough preparation for that, so I just wanted to mention that as a side note. Okay, so that was Pope Leo XIII. Makes perfect sense, right? If there is a pope reigning, you must obey the present pope. You must submit to that pope. You can't say, but on this matter, on this particular disciplinary matter, for example, let's take the lowering the age for First Holy Communion, as St. Pius X did. Not everybody was thrilled with that decision, right? And a number of people, clerics, thought, this is going to lead to a lot of sacrilege. All these young kids, they don't know what they're how could a 6-year-old really know, or barely of the age of reason, right? How could such a little child know what he's receiving in Holy Communion? Because before, I think Holy Communion was given maybe at age 12 for the first time or something like that. And, at the time, I'm sure you could perhaps, you could legitimately have that concern. You could say, well, I don't think this was a really, maybe the best possible decision here. But it didn't matter if you thought that the point was that the Pope had decreed it, and that's what you were going to do now. Okay, you were now going to give First Holy Communion to little children. And that's how obedience works, and that's what makes it so meritorious, that you obey even though you don't think it's a good idea, or even though you find it difficult. The only time you're allowed and required to disobey if the Pope is commanding you to sin. But the Pope, first of all, it wasn't a command in the moral sense of, commanding someone to sin. It was a law that he established. And that's significant because the Church's universal law cannot be in itself harmful, dangerous, sacrilegious, and so on. So oftentimes these things get confused, and then that's where a lot of recognize and resist traditionalists are mistaken, and that's what keeps a lot of them from becoming sedevacantists, I think, because they think that they have all these justifications for rejecting church law. You can't do that. Church law is not the same as the Pope giving you a command, for example, to rob a bank so he can build a bigger church. That would be a sinful command. Now, you might say, well, what if the Pope establishes a law telling people to steal so the church can have more money? The Pope cannot do that. Okay, he could not. What that means, again, is not that when he does it, we declare it null and void, but rather that the Pope will never issue such a decree. Otherwise, the divine assistance to the papacy would be meaningless. You could say that about any institution. Well, when the boss does something he's not supposed to be doing, you just ignore it and resist it. Right? Is that what we're saying about the papacy? Is that how God established the papacy? How is that going to keep the gates of hell from prevailing?
Well, it feels like an attractive proposition now, because they've already submitted to the idea that the Roman Pontiff can, on occasion, teach grave errors in authoritative papal instruments, such as we find in Amoris Laetitia.
Yeah.
And once you cross that bridge and say the Pope can do that, then obviously he can float erroneous opinions or harmful opinions about disciplines and liturgical matters.
Yes. Then
and therefore we must resist.
Yes, and then it's a slippery slope, and you can say, well, gee, maybe Vatican I, there's this infallibility thing. Not everybody supported it at the council, and I think, to be honest, Kwasniewski is going in that direction. And in fact, let me point you to an article. There's a number of articles on Novus Ordo Watch in refutation of Peter Kwasniewski. Lengthy stuff, detailed stuff, hopefully scholarly stuff. And to my knowledge, he has never addressed or responded to a single one of them. The only thing he ever contacted me about was when I got his credentials wrong. Okay? That's when he contacted me, and I immediately issued a correction. No problem. I'm not trying to downplay or, mislead anybody regarding credentials. But it would be nice if maybe he could respond to some of the other things, and don't say that, oh, this is just not worth his time. No. It's worth his time. Okay. The refutations that are up there are powerful enough for that. So you can't just say, well, he just doesn't think it's really that great. No, it's powerful enough to where it would definitely need a response from him.
And I would say, Mario, even if Peter's never moved to engage what you've posted in way of refutation on your website, to viewers watching this, a lot of the people watching this, they're probably people that follow you, maybe follow me. They're pretty much, on board. They understand what's at play here. I would encourage them to share that information with people who follow Peter. Because again, this isn't a personal thing.
Yeah.
Peter seems to be a very sincere man. He's knowledgeable in many ways. He has a vast following, and the people who follow him are likewise sincere. They want to be Catholic.
Sure.
They're looking for someone to fill that vacuum that's been left behind because the chair of Peter's been empty for so long.
Yes.
Those are the folks that really need to slowly and prayerfully go through these refutations that you provided so they can see just how far off the mark this resist the Pope movement is.
Indeed. And I should perhaps, just emphasize that because oftentimes people will, make the objection that, oh, well, you shouldn't be so harsh about these things. We're all just trying to figure this out. And it's, not everybody understands this or that. And understood. That's perfectly fine on like a, person to person level. I would never, be like hard on someone for not figuring it all out right away. Okay. I didn't either. There's still many questions that we have as sedevacantists, many unresolved issues and so forth. That's not the point. But what's happening here is more than just Peter Kwasniewski isn't just someone trying to figure it out. Peter Kwasniewski is someone who gives lectures, who writes books, who posts articles constantly that is directing other people about these things. And based on what he says, people make decisions like where they're going to move their family so they can attend Holy Mass, where they will approach a priest to have their sins forgiven, and so forth. Like, these are important things. So, this is not just Joe Blow who's sitting in a shed somewhere in Kentucky trying to figure out what to do. This is serious business, and Kwasniewski is prolific, right? He writes a lot, and that's why I think it's only fair to engage with that critically, and unfortunately, you never get a response, at least not, we say the vacantes don't. Maybe on Twitter a little bit occasionally, but not in terms of like, okay, here's our response to your article. What say you? You know, that has never happened. But regarding, I was just saying, right, that Kwasniewski is going a little bit in the direction of denying Vatican I, right? And that. I'm not saying he's denying Vatican I. I'm saying he's going in that direction. He's starting to show a tendency in that direction. And Louis, I'm going to, if you want to, I'm sending you the link right now. On August 2nd, 2024, I put up this post on Novus Ordo Watch. Peter Kwasniewski laments heretical book denying papal infallibility is out of print. Okay? And he did that on Facebook, right? Where he's showing people the cover or the first pages of this book called Origins of Papal Infallibility, 1150 to 1350 by Brian Tierney, originally published in, what is it, I think 1988. No, 1972. Okay. And he posted that on Facebook and said, it's absurd that this book is out of print. Okay. Now he's got a lot of followers. So a lot of people see this and they see that he says it's absurd that this book is out of print. That's a heretical book. Okay. Now, I actually then responded to this on Facebook, and he responded to the comment and said, essentially, well, you know, I was just expressing exasperation that a scholarly book, however wrong it may be on certain points, is out of print and thus inaccessible. To which I then responded, your post was a de facto promotion of the work, and you know it. You made countless people aware of the existence of this heretical book, and it's not rash to suspect that that was precisely your intent. Otherwise, you would have kept your exasperation to yourself. Okay? This is what I mean. Like, it's dangerous stuff. He's lamenting that a heretical book is out of print, and that's all he says, right? And so many people see that, and you know, this book openly questions or openly states that papal infallibility is an invention of the Middle Ages. That's serious business. Because,
no question. And Maury, this makes me wonder, and this isn't a personal attack on Peter, to what extent does he really appreciate the grave responsibility that he has to tread very lightly and be very careful not to mislead people? It recently came to my attention through you that he's republishing a work by Romano Guardini.
Guardini, yes.
Guardini, which is, I mean, this is a man was instrumental in the liturgical movement, who talked about stressing the meal at Holy Mass over and against the altar and the sacrifice. This guy is no hero, and I was actually a little surprised to see that he wants to republish that man's work, but based on his commentary here on this heretical work opposing the infallibility of the Pope, it tells me that he's playing a little fast and loose with the responsibility that goes with being a teacher.
Yes, yes. And it's, well, you know, he's presuming to essentially overturn papal judgments, what he believes are papal judgments, right? He's presuming to tell people whether or not they can use a certain breviary that is technically forbidden by church law, and so on. He already questions canonizations, solemn canonizations that the man he believes is Pope has made. And he questions an ecumenical, what he believes to be an ecumenical council. Why wouldn't he question Vatican I at some point, especially if it keeps conflicting with his idea of tradition, right? Just as he just is starting to question St. Pius X. And maybe at this point we should show people the article in which Kwasniewski actually essentially accused St. Pius X of succumbing to liturgical modernism.
Here we go, Mario.
Yep.
This is Peter writing. Paradoxically, the Pope who fought valiantly against doctrinal modernism exemplified liturgical modernism by rupturing the principle of the inviolability of long-standing tradition in the name of easing up pastoral burdens.
Mm-hmm.
And just to be clear, what's going on here, he's accusing Pope Pius X of being a liturgical modernist.
Yes.
which
Ironically, he said this in an article entitled "The Need for Mutual Humility and Support Between the SSPX and the FSSP." If you scroll up just a little bit, you'll see the link to it. Above that quote,
there we
February
go.
4th, 2019. You see it?
Right here.
Yeah. So if you click on that, it'll show you that's the actual article on the new Liturgical Movement website. That's how crazy it is now. Instead of maybe, taking a second look at his principle of, what was it now? The principle of the inviolability of longstanding tradition. Well, maybe the principle is false, or at least in the way you think it should be implemented, or the way you think it should be applied. Maybe there's something you're not understanding. No, he's now accusing the quintessential anti-modernist pope of being a modernist liturgically.
Pretty
I mean,
stunning. Stunning.
insane. Where does it end?
It doesn't end. And, Peter's talked quite openly about this concept that maybe it's time for us to rethink the papacy. Well,
Yes.
clearly, he has rethought it.
He has
He's
rethought
repackaged
yes.
it, and he's selling it to a very large audience.
Mhm.
And the product that he's selling is that the Pope, when you get right down to it, he's one opinion among many. And it's not even the most important opinion in
Yeah.
many cases. It's one that needs to be overridden by the opinion of scholarly men such as himself.
That's the problem. And apparently nobody is going to tell him otherwise, because if he won't accept correction from St. Pius X, well, who's he going to accept it from?
Right.
You know?
And Mario, this invites a thought that I've had many different times, and I'm sure you've voiced it before too. If we're alive to see, God willing, a
Yeah.
true, holy Catholic Pope,
Yeah.
come to the chair of Peter, when he begins to reign and to rule in a manner that rubs a Peter Kwasniewski the wrong way, is he going to obey that man?
Mhm.
Are his many followers going to follow that man as though he's the father, teacher, and guide of the faithful? No, many of
Yeah.
them will not. Why? Because they've been trained to look at the Pope through Protestant eyes.
Yes.
And that's one of the great tragedies that will outlive the current crisis. When we get a new Pope, there's going to be a new crisis, and that's going to be breaking all of these people who follow the resist the Pope movement
Yes.
of that terrible habit.
Yeah. And, I don't want to switch to this other article now, but let me just mention it here because it fits right in. A day after Kwasniewski published his article on the Pre-55 Breviary, on his personal blog, he published what he called an ironic response to an Orthodox convert's critique of the papacy. I think it should be called an ironic response, because it was rather ironic, because as he's trying to explain to the Eastern Orthodox, why he should be a Catholic, he's pointing out that there really needs to be a final arbiter of disputes, and one who can, settle controversies and so forth. And of course, he's talking about the Pope. Well, isn't it ironic that when it comes to defending Catholicism against the Orthodox, suddenly Peter Kwasniewski remembers that the Pope is the final arbiter. He just doesn't accept the Pope. Actually, as we can see, not only not Francis, who isn't even a Pope, but not even St. Pius X, or who else? Who knows where else where he's going to go next with this? And so I would have some comments on that article as well, but we'll just leave it here for now. Yes, so he's asking in his article on the Pre-55 Breviary, I quoted him, where he was starting to refer again to Benedict XVI, right? And where Benedict XVI said the following, quote, "The Pope is not an absolute monarch whose thoughts and desires are law. The Pope knows that in his important decisions, he is bound to the great community of faith of all times," unquote. Again, he's quoting Ratzinger, right? Joseph Ratzinger, the that is apparently the only source he can quote where it says the Pope is not an absolute monarch. And that says a lot, because Ratzinger, of course, himself did not believe in the papacy, at least not as defined by Vatican I. If instead we look at, for example, St. Robert Bellarmine, doctor of the Church, doctor of the papacy, he did talk about, he used that term, absolute monarchy. St. Robert Bellarmine wrote this, I guess, in a tract or a letter, or I guess it was a tract, like a little pamphlet or something, in response to the French theologian Jean Gerson, right, Jean Gerson, who died in 1429. He wrote, this is Bellarmine speaking, quote, "For the Church of Christ is a most perfect kingdom and an absolute monarchy, which neither depends on the people nor has from it its origin, but depends on the divine will alone," unquote. Well, if the Church is an absolute monarchy, who do you think is the absolute monarch?
Right.
Right?
Good question.
Yes. Now you might say, "Oh, well, God is." Okay, but God has a vicar, right? I mean, the Church on earth is established as a monarchy. And by the way, the only people who deny that are modernists, right? They think, or synodalists, nowadays. But that's how Christ, I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? Because God is a monarch, and so his church on earth is also a monarchy, right? A hierarchy. And it always comes back again to the papacy. Do we believe in the papacy? Do we believe that the Pope, regardless of his human failings, possesses an office that is divine in origin and has certain prerogatives and enjoys the divine assistance, not only in matters of infallibility, like when ex-cathedra pronouncements, but just in general is divinely assisted, not always with infallibility, but at least with safety, right? He's always the safe rule to follow. And so we see that, for example, Pius XI pointed that out, when he spoke about holy matrimony, right? His encyclical on Christian marriage, Casti Connubii, 1930, I believe it was, where he mentions, and I like to have everything I say, I'd like to be able to back it up. So let me briefly pull this up here and quote it. So let me quote you that from Casti Connubii. This is Casti Connubii number 104, where Pope Pius XI said, "A characteristic of all true followers of Christ, lettered or unlettered, is to suffer themselves to be guided and led in all things that touch upon faith or morals by the Holy Church of God through its supreme pastor, the Roman Pontiff, who is himself guided by Jesus Christ, our Lord." Unquote. So this is important because he's saying this specifically in the context of non-infallible things, because some people were, I guess, raising the objection that, well, the Church's prohibition of contraception, that's not an infallible declaration, and that's not a dogma or whatever. And he said, hey, you have to submit to everything the Pope teaches, because he is guided by Christ, and not only in terms of infallible dogmatic pronouncements, but just in general, as in setting forth doctrine. He is guided, meaning he can't be saying anything that would undermine the faith or contradict the faith, or anything of that sort. So he is and remains the safe norm to follow for Catholics. Otherwise, if it weren't so, then all these papal teachings about following the Pope would not make any sense.
Right. Now, Mario, for those who might listen to that quote and say, yeah, but we're talking about the liturgy now.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a matter of faith and morals. Of course, I would vehemently disagree, but so would Pius XII, who said in, I think it was Mediator Dei, he said the entire liturgy has the Catholic faith for its content. The liturgy is the Catholic faith.
Yeah.
expressed in the church's
Yeah.
worship.
As
So of course it covers this.
yes, and also, I mean, he wasn't, speaking in the context of. I mean, he was specifically, I guess, trying to speak to what he had set forth on Christian marriage, and then pointed out faith and morals. Right? He didn't say only in those matters. Right, but those were the
Right.
matters he was speaking about, and as you just said, either way you look at it, I mean, sacred liturgy obviously is so closely connected with the faith that the church herself, if the church could promulgate heretical liturgy, right, or sacrilegious liturgy, that would so totally attack the faith that it would be tantamount to denying the faith. Right, it would be the same thing in effect, because the sacred liturgy is what every practicing Catholic comes in contact with at least once a week. Whereas, how often they study the catechism, that's kind of up to them in a sense. But and the church teaches that she is infallible in her universal disciplinary laws and liturgical rites. That is another important thing. And you can find these things. Some might say, well, where's that in Vatican I? I don't think Vatican I specifically deals with that, because it's talking about the papacy. But you'll find it in the dogmatic manuals, whether before or after Vatican well, certainly after Vatican I, just because in case anything needed clarification, it would have been clarified at the council. But that is, you can look this up. In other words, anything we're saying here is not, it's not about, my opinion or Louie's opinion. It's you look it up, right? We're not authorities. We're nobody should accept anything we say because we say it, but because it's what the church says. And you can look that up. We can just go into expert opinion number 3.
Hey, Mario, before we go there, there was a part to his reply to the monk who I think was opinion number 2.
Yeah.
And I've seen this quote bandied about recently by a priest on X recently. And Peter writes, I'm reminded here of an exchange at the trial of St. Thomas More.
Mm-hmm.
And he's quoting, "What more? You wish to be considered wiser and of better conscience than all the bishops and nobles of the realm?" To which More replied, "My lord, for one bishop of your opinion, I have 100 saints of mine. And for one parliament of yours, and God knows of what kind, I have all the general councils for 1,000 years. And for one kingdom, I have France and all the kingdoms of Christendom." End quote. I saw this quote cited, I guess it was just earlier last week, and I think you interacted with this Father Maudsley, and he was making the same kind of point about the necessity, or at least the reasonableness of using a pre-1955 liturgy.
Yeah.
And he provided this as some support for it.
Yeah.
And my thought is, where this falls apart is nothing about the 1955 revision of Holy Week or the 1958 rubrics in any way, shape, or form went against the general councils of 1,000 years at all.
Yeah.
I mean, it's apples and oranges. It just, the argument does not fit the question.
It's a false analogy. It has nothing to do with anything really, because first of all, we're not talking about now let me see, who's St. Thomas More responding to there? It just says the
he's
trial.
On trial, apparently.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, ultimately, we were talking about the Church of England, right, establishing itself. Well, they had the King Henry VIII, and they had, I guess, apostate bishops, right, heretical, schismatic bishops, that were supporting that because they didn't want to have their heads cut off. But certainly the Pope was with St. Thomas More. St. Thomas More wasn't going against the Pope, appealing to councils and tradition or whatever. The quote makes no sense in this context here, to use that as an argument. It's a false analogy. The situation is in no way similar to that. And St. Thomas More wasn't wasn't opposing the Pope. He wasn't dismissing the Church's highest authority. On the contrary, the Church backed St. Thomas More. He was in communion with the Church, and he was going against heretics and schismatics. The fact that Kwasniewski would use that as an argument, it just kind of, I think, shows that they're really grasping for straws. I mean, what does he have? So he's got Joseph Ratzinger and this inapplicable quote from St. Thomas More.
Well, see,
Again,
this is where you go when you think that the heretics that have been claiming to be popes really are popes, and that these authoritative teachings coming out of Rome really are coming from the Church.
that's what they think.
Then, pardon me?
That's what Kwasniewski thinks, right?
Of course, right. So now, all bets are off. And so, standing with the Church can mean opposing the Pope. It has to.
I don't know. I'm at a loss for words, So it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He's got no sources. He's got his opinion, right? He's eliciting other expert opinions, but besides opinions, that's all he's got. And he does not have the theology to back it up, at least not in this article. And that's why he has to, tap Benedict XVI and that quote from St. Thomas More. Or is it actually St. Thomas More, or was it from the movie A Man for All Seasons? I don't know.
Yeah, could have been from Hollywood.
The real St. Thomas More. But either way,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not apropos to this, what we're talking about. And again, Kwasniewski is being driven to this bad theology and this bad argumentation because he doesn't want to be a sedevacantist.
That's the bottom line.
Right.
This is the extent that you have to go to avoid what, to me and to you, is patently obvious.
Yes.
These men are not Catholics. They're not popes.
Yes. And again, I realize sedevacantism is not very popular. It's not very attractive, but that shouldn't have anything to do with any of it. The expert opinion number 3, then he interacts with, and who knows? I don't know who it is, of course, since all these experts are anonymous. But it says diocesan priest and canon lawyer. He at least starts out pretty well. He says the command to pray the office must. Sorry, let me quote the whole thing. At first glance, it would seem that the command to pray the office must be fulfilled by the use of an edition that has been promulgated and proposed for its fulfillment. Unquote. Precisely, and that's what canon law, remember, canon 135 said it has to be the approved liturgical books. And then this expert goes into legislative silence, and then he, advances his opinion about what one could say and implicit approval, and it suggests, and it could also with silence on the side. So he's looking for a way to, make that permissible within the context of the Vatican II Church. And of course, this is what I talked about earlier, where they're trying to resolve this question of whether or not the Pre-55 Breviary is permitted under the supposition that Francis is the Pope, the Vatican II religion is, well, Catholicism, somehow at least, and that Summorum Pontificum, well, it's now abrogated, but was once in force, and that Traditionis Custodes is now in force, unless, at least that's what the expert, this expert diocesan priest and canon lawyer thinks. I guess Kwasniewski wouldn't agree with that, unless I misread something here. Oh no, he does mention Traditionis Custodes, so he does apparently agree that it's authoritative to some degree. But so I would agree, of course, that if you're trying to make this work with the supposition that Francis is the Pope, who cares, right? Who cares which breviary you pray? Because with Francis, you can have divinely willed adultery. You have divinely willed false religions. You have ecumenism, Anglicans offering their invalid Eucharist in a Catholic church on a Catholic altar. None of these things matter anymore. So what would it matter if you're, which breviary you pray? Well, yeah. Well, but then if Francis is Pope, then none of it matters. Nothing matters.
Right.
And then the papacy actually would be false altogether if he were Pope. Which, of course,
Mario,
in
this
turn
expert
would mean he's not Pope, because if the papacy is false, then there is no Pope. But
certainly.
so it's
So
just
this expert number 3, he states that furthermore, I would add that in the modern legislation for the preconciliar liturgy, Summorum Pontificum Traditionis Custodes, etc., there is no explicit prohibition of the use of the earlier breviaries. But you provided a quote from Pius X that very explicitly did provide a prohibition from using previous versions, correct?
yes. I don't know if he means to include Pius X in this, though.
Now this,
Right,
this particular expert may not, but
yeah,
of course, Peter started off the article by
that's
saying
right.
this, of course, invites questions about the Pius X breviary and using previous editions.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, it's just, chaos all around. I really liked expert opinion number 4, though, because it says another Benedictine, and of course, this is the one that Peter Kwasniewski really takes issue with. But this man really just states exactly, like in the first 2 paragraphs, for example, it makes a lot of sense, and this is exactly also the as far as I understand, what the correct answer would be. He says here, I was not convinced by the Benedictine's first opinion. When he calls the priest's opinion legal positivism, is he denying that this is a matter of positive law, like which breviary to pray to fulfill the obligation? Or is he saying that even though it is a matter of positive law, it should be obvious that this particular law is beyond the authority of the legislator? As far as I can see, the only real argument he gives in his first response is that the old office is much longer than that of Paul VI. To me, this is not convincing. If I am bound by a lawful superior to go to Texas, I don't fulfill my duty by going to China on the grounds that it is a harder trip. All right? The comparison is not
I found that
simply,
amusing.
yeah, the comparison is not simply more in the sense that option 2 includes everything option 1 includes plus some. That will be different. For the question is not, can a priest pray the whole Paul VI office and then pray the pre-55 in addition, which of course he could, but rather can he replace the one with the other? The church is a visible body with a visible head who has a real legislative authority. One must allow that positive laws can exist and should be obeyed, even when they are bad laws. I don't mean sinful, but just mistaken or dumb or otherwise flawed. So that's pretty much right on the money. And you know what? Here, and of course, like I said, you're right, Kwasniewski has a lot to say about that expert's opinion, because Kwasniewski has his own opinion, and of course it's not the one that you would find in the pre-Vatican II theology books. But maybe this is where we should point to a book published in 1912, right after Pius X issued his breviary reform. The book is called The History of the Roman Breviary. And so it had already been published before 1911, but then, of course, a new edition came out that incorporates the 1911, the Divino Afflatu decree of Pope Pius X. And at the end, this is on pages 329 and 330. The author, Father Pierre Batiffol, Batiffol, I think Pierre is his first name, pages 329 to 330, he mentions that he hints at not personally liking the new breviary of Pope Pius X, and that's within his right to say, I wish the Pope had acted differently. I wish it were different. But notice that he does not simply say, well, the Pope overstepped his authority, the Pope, blah, 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 the decree is invalid or anything like that. He simply, well, let me read to you what he does say, because it is so well stated, and how different it is from the kind of language that Peter Kwasniewski uses, where he just declares on his own authority that Traditionis Custodes is null and void. So here we go. Father Battiful says the following, quote, "The reform of Pius X is bound to incur the reproach of being indebted in its innovations to the Parisian Breviary of 1736. It is impossible to disclaim this indebtedness, and if we may be permitted to express our mind freely, we regret the indebtedness." And then I don't know if this is the very next paragraph or if there's some more in between, but here's another quote from Father Battiful. "For all these reasons, and without meaning to say that the present reform leaves room for no regret, no criticism, no possible amendment, we hail it with joy for what it has preserved, what it has restored, and what it promises. We hail it as historians who are aware of the extreme difficulty of the problem that had to be resolved, or that had to be solved, and as liturgists who, like the old provost of Tongres, felt that it was only from Rome that a reform of the Roman Breviary could be hoped for." And then there comes a Latin phrase, "Donec de urbe veniat it quod erit magis perfectum," which artificial intelligence tells me means until there comes from the city of Rome, that which will be more perfect. Gentle, very respectful to the Pope, right? Very polite way of just, putting your own opinion in there. Like I'm not entirely thrilled with all the changes, and yet in no wise questioning the papal authority or the papal judgment or anything. All right. So contrast that with Peter Kwasniewski, who just declares a decree invalid and accuses the Pope of liturgical modernism and so on. And when I said decree invalid, I was referring to Francis' Traditionis Custodes, not Pius X's Divino Afflatu, because he's not questioning the whole decree. He's only questioning the part that prohibits any other breviaries, if I'm not mistaken, right? Let's have a brief look at how Peter Kwasniewski responds to this expert opinion number 4, which I thought was the best one. And so, of course, he says, "I think the logically possible approaches are well summarized in the expert opinions 1, 2, and 3, not 4. Right? Does a pope have authority to require a certain form of prayer?" Well, let me interrupt here for a second. Well, obviously, yes. Of course he does. Again, Matthew 16:19. That part about the keys to the kingdom. What you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. I mean, what a concept, right? The Pope has the authority to require a certain form of prayer. Anyway, Kwasniewski says, "I think the question is ambiguous. If the form he requires represents a radical break with the form required for centuries and centuries, then we might have a problem on our hands, one that could result in a true crisis of conscience." Okay, but that's just his opinion. Okay, he has certainly not shown any evidence for that. And as far as conscience goes, it was St. Pius X, whom we quoted earlier, his address Con Vera Soddisfazione, that actually specifically mentioned conscience. Let me briefly find this again here. The Pope said, responding to, talking about the innovators, he was criticizing, quote, "They limit obedience to purely exterior actions, even if they do not resist authority or rebel against it, opposing the faulty judgment of some individual without any real competence or of their own inner conscience, deceived by vain subtleties," unquote. So I just thought it was interesting that Kwasniewski here brings up a crisis of conscience. So he simply will not accept, Kwasniewski will not accept that maybe he's just wrong. Okay, and maybe his research is wrong, or there's something he's misunderstanding. Maybe he's not understanding something correctly. He keeps bringing up as one of his premises this, how tradition, like basically tradition, gives us the right to like curbs the Pope's authority when he forbids praying the divine office in the way it was done before, if it was done for centuries and centuries. But that premise is false. And so Kwasniewski writes, this is where the fateful combination of legal positivism and ever-expanding ultramontanism presses comes in. For the question is rendered easy if you say the Pope has absolute authority over everything liturgical, or that the only duty of the subordinate to obey his will or his whims. And so, here, Kwasniewski, you can see he's not taking into consideration the divine assistance for the papacy, okay? As if he needed to find a way to curb the Pope from abusing his authority, as if God hadn't already made the papacy, constituted the papacy in such a way that that is impossible, right? In the way we explained earlier with Pius XI, and we're not saying that the Pope cannot be a terrible sinner, but that his official, the exercise of his office, could not be like he could not issue a decree, permitting theft or something, right? That simply would never happen because God would prevent it. And so Kwasniewski talks about, again, legal positivism and ever-expanding ultramontanism. Okay, ultramontanism is Catholicism, and as far as legal positivism, well, he makes it seem as if any positive law of the Church is already is already problematic because, it's positivism. Well, you know what ism I think he should be worried about? I'm going to call it Kwasniewskiism, but that's the one he never is concerned about. He's never in any way worried about that. So Kwasniewski, skipping a little bit, says the fact that there is no explicit statement that the Pope cannot cancel out received and approved rites of venerable standing is because it would have seemed ridiculous to our forebears to think that he could. Now, that's a curious way of looking at it. And then he brings up an episode from Vatican I, which is interesting, which I researched a little bit, where one of the bishops at the council proposed that there should be an anathema given. This should be included in a document that essentially says, let's see if I can find it here. Do you have it?
I have the quote that Peter offered.
Okay, now before the final vote on Pastor Aeternus at Vatican I, several council fathers were concerned that they would be voting for a doctrine that would give the Pope absolute and unqualified jurisdictional authority. Various documented discussions were given by members of the Deputation of the Faith, assuring the council fathers that this was not a correct understanding of the doctrine. That is, they stated that the Pope in his jurisdictional authority does not have absolute and unqualified jurisdictional authority. One council father, however, an American named Bishop Vera of Savannah, apparently was not convinced and requested that specific qualifying statements to the effect that the Pope's jurisdictional authority is qualified be inserted into the text of the schemas. He was told that the council fathers had not come to Rome to hear buffooneries. In other words, if the bishop had understood the theological context of the schema, he would not have put himself in such an embarrassing situation. Unquote. Now, I researched that and found the sentence that he wanted inserted into the text about it was essentially something like, if anyone says that the Pope has the right, or that the Pope has the power to change anything in the Church at his mere whim, let him be anathema. Okay, and this is what he was told was that it's buffoonery, right? It's silliness. But I think Kwasniewski is not. he's not really, I don't think that actually it supports his argument very much, because of course it would be silly to include something like that in a council, because it couldn't happen, right? You might as well say, if anyone says that the Pope could proclaim heresy, let him be anathema. It can't happen because God would prevent it, not because when the Pope issues such a decree, then Peter Kwasniewski comes along and tells everybody the decree is invalid. So I didn't think that this was a terribly good argument to include in his article either. So
I agree. I mean, look, the Pope had already spoken about the Pope and strongly suggested his inability to deviate from the faith when it talked about the gift of truth and never failing faith being conferred upon Peter and his successors. So it's not as if Vatican Council I didn't touch on this topic at all. It did very explicitly.
Right, exactly. And I guess that's what they were, the deputation of the faith, that's what they were saying. Like, if you listened to, what we said, the theological context of the schemas and so on, you wouldn't be coming up with such a silly anathema, right? Such a proposal, such a silly proposal for an anathema. So again, I really don't see very strong evidence for Peter Kwasniewski's opinion. And again, ultimately, it is only his opinion anyway. And against his opinion are the decrees of the people he considers popes. So
right, and it's a curious thing that he attempted at the very end of this article, which normally that's where you make your strongest point if you're trying to argue a particular case, that he wanted to hang his hat on this incident that happened at Vatican I, that a truly valid ecumenical council of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, and nobody questions its validity, under the guidance and approval of the Pope, chose not to produce. There's a reason. It was they chose not to add that particular statement. Yet he wants to move forward as if that's a good reason to believe his argument. I guess he's saying it should have been included. And the council failed by not including it.
Yeah. And like I've said before, if such a scenario were possible, you would then need an authority above the Roman pontiff to adjudicate that.
Right.
And that's impossible per Catholic dogma. So, but this is what refusing to countenance sedevacantism gets you, I guess. Yes, we also have a few unresolved issues and difficulties of various stripes, but it's nothing like this where you have to throw out Catholicism altogether. And so I think this pretty much covers, the essence of what we needed to talk about here. Maybe some other time we can talk about Kwasniewski's article in which he responds to the Orthodox convert, and he tries to defend the papacy there. That was published March 27th. So
right, and in this article, he recognizes the fact that there has to be this authority figure.
Yes. Yes,
I mean, and he will write and speak about the received and approved rites of the church and how venerable they are. But the approved part, who gets to approve? What does it mean for a rite of the Holy Catholic Church to be approved, apart from the Pope?
And exactly. And I think he would probably say, well, the fact that it's been used for centuries and centuries, that confers upon it like an intrinsic approval. Maybe it does, like materially, in and of itself, but certainly not against the judgment of the Pope.
Right.
Right. So they're trying to find a way to counter the papal judgment and to declare it null and void. And you cannot do that within the parameters of Catholic doctrine and dogma. It's impossible. And that's why they have such a mess on their hands.
Mario, I think the question that everything that we talked about today invites with respect to the Resist the Pope movement is the question, is nothing sacred? And so like everything is on the table. And one of the thoughts that I had recently was, what's to stop them from wanting to turn the clock back before the Council of Trent? and before Missale Romanum of Pius V. And it ends up there really is nothing. I'm having trouble opening the screen, but Timothy Flanders, who is, by all indications, a follower of Peter Kwasniewski, he obviously admires him a great deal. He even floated the idea of, maybe we need to fight to return to the liturgical diversity that existed before the Council of Trent. In other words, Pius V, when he suppressed those rites that were not 200 years old, then maybe he made a mistake.
Clearly,
everything's on the table.
Yeah, what did he know about these things, right? Yeah, but it just shows the insanity. Like, soon they'll be wanting to go back to apostolic times, and the very antiquarianism condemned by Pius XII, right? Oh, maybe we should use the table again instead of an altar, and that's what the apostles did, right? Something like that. Anything is possible at that point. Even, as we saw, quoting Ratzinger to correct St. Pius X. At that point, it's over. Okay. Anything is possible now. And this under the label of traditionalism, that's the point. That the modernists would use Ratzinger to correct St. Pius X. That's clear. But this is, I have long suspected that this kind of traditionalism is leading them to modernism. Absolutely is. They may not realize it yet, but I think in a lot of ways that you can already see that. Maybe that's why, for example, Peter Kwasniewski is on record thinking, the theology of the body of John Paul II, it's not all that bad. And, Romano Guardini is now being reprinted, although we must say it was a book from that was originally published in the 1920s. And I don't know the content of the book, but yeah, Romano Guardini, certainly his influence on the liturgical movement has not been good. Although there may very well be.
Yeah, even if that particular book is somewhat solid, unless it comes with a whole lot of caveats, I would hesitate to draw people toward him.
Yes.
Thinking that he personally is a solid figure.
Yeah.
But, well, Mario, this has been fun. I've enjoyed it a great deal. And I think the last thing I would say is that, look, the people watching this, I think for the most part, they're going to be nodding and agreeing most of the way through. But I think the challenge that we have is to reach the people that are presently confused and following men like Peter Kwasniewski. And, he's leading them, I'm sure with good intentions, but he's leading them further and further away from a Catholic understanding of the papacy and the church herself.
Yes.
And they're the ones that really need to see this and prayerfully consider the points that you raised today.
Yes.
And I hope they do that.
And I'll repeat, don't follow us either. Follow the Catholic teaching from before Vatican II. Look it up. And in the show notes, we'll provide some links for where you can look it up. So that's what I try to do with Novus Ordo Watch, is provide the actual Catholic sources that refute the Vatican II religion.
That's where the treasure is. That's for sure. Thank you, Mario. Looking forward to doing it again soon.
Thank you, Louie. Take care and God bless.
God bless you.